I call the Honourable Member, Dr. Rajin Prasad. Namaste.
Namaste, Mr. Speaker. Thank you very much. I'm pleased to take a call on the final reading of this bill, but to do it with some sadness, because this is the kind of measure that in this area ought to be supported. There ought to be agreement across the House when we are trying to improve a system. But this bill doesn't do that, or this series of bills now don't actually do that. And I want to go through the three major drivers to this bill as we see it, Mr. Speaker. The first driver here is the increasing costs in the family court system. And let me talk a little bit about that, because it seems to have become a principle by which this government operates. If something we are doing is costing more, then by definition there's something wrong with it and we must reduce it, without actually having a look to see why is that cost increasing. And so when we do that, you know, the only argument we get from this minister and from this process is that this is out of hand because it costs too much. And because it costs too much, we must now find a system that actually destroys the very value of the services provided in the family court. The family court is 30-odd years old, and it has stood us well. You know, it's a well-developed system. That's not to say it can't be tweaked. It can always be tweaked. But in trying to only keep a focus on the financial driver for this particular area of change, what the government has forgotten to do, Mr. Speaker, is to calculate the advantages of that as well. And the government has not done that. And we've had no discussion about what is the value of the kind of services that's provided in the family court and provided through legal aid to those who end up in this particular place. So it's a government that knows the price of everything but the value of nothing. It has not demonstrated its understanding of the benefits to those vulnerable people who find themselves in this particular situation. The bill and the government has been very ready to spend large sums of money elsewhere. Now, if we look at it, I mean, I think the figure is 13 million as what the cost of this service is. Now, if the cost that's being cut. Now, if that's what all it is, then a country with a budget like ours, and a country with a soul like we purport to have, then why is that become such a problem that we cannot actually provide the kinds of intensive services our most vulnerable children have? Mainly it's children, parents who are separating, and it's the adults who make up the mess. It's the children who pay the price. To actually get the right services there so that change can occur. And yet we're prepared to spend, you know, inordinately much larger sums of money to address some other presumed advantage. And the government has not explained that. The ministers have not explained that. So I think the financial driver behind this is hard to actually be convinced by, because it's what the government has done for a long time. And it may just be that the real driver behind this is the government trying to hide its own mistakes. The mistakes it made in 2009 with the unaffordable tax cuts, etc. And the long-term effect of that economic plan is that the government now has to cobble together even small sums of money from very, very good programs just to balance the books. Now, it's selling whatever it can sell. It's cutting programs like this. You know, in the scheme of things, very cheap programs, not expensive at all, and doing a lot of good, certainly doing no harm. And yet this bill puts that aside. I can't imagine Tim McIndoe actually being supportive of something like that when I know he understands the children who find themselves in this position, who do, and I have respect for the member, who knows that by providing the right amount of resources, the right kind of assistance, the right kind of disputes resolution procedures, making sure there's no financial pressures on them, actually resolves the situation. But no, this is not what they're doing. What they have, and this is the awful consequence of the government's long-term policy. It has made so much expenditure that it need not have made, should not have made, it's not producing the benefits, and now it's having to cut deep into many of the programs that are for the vulnerable. But the government has become rather nonchalant at making cuts to programs for the poor. It's done that all across the board. And under the guise of whether it's welfare dependency or inefficient programs, etc., it's made all of those cuts. And yet, the other day, when the botulism scare was on, the government offered a couple of $1 million to the companies that were working and had to travel to China to sort that out. They didn't even ask for that. They didn't even ask for that. But the government was very quick to make public monies available, a couple of $1 million. And I heard the interviews from the owners of those companies. We didn't ask for this. Nice to have. Now, how about that kind of thinking when it comes to providing for our vulnerable? Mr. Speaker, the second driver of this particular bill is something that the member Scott Simpson spoke about a few minutes ago, is this. The argument has gone that we know that the many, many more people resolve their disputes themselves. And that's true. They do. But from there, the logic is so lost. Therefore, everybody must do that. Now, that belies logic. Because the very point is that the small number who cannot resolve their difficulties end up in this particular situation. And therefore, they are at the sharper end. Therefore, they do require the kind of services the family court currently provides. And yet, under the guise of that principle that because so many resolve their issues themselves, we now don't need to provide these services to this more vulnerable group at the sharp end, it doesn't make any sense to do that. But it's a justification. It's an intellectually dishonest justification, Mr. Speaker, when the government says that for those reasons we'll take all of these services off. Well, one of the things that has happened is the change in family form over probably the last 20 or 30 years. The family form has changed. The nature of the family today is very different from the traditional families in which many of us were brought up. And there are many, many different types of families, and they form and reform all of the time. That is happening all over the world. Any cursory review of our family form statistics in New Zealand will show that now family form is different. One of the consequences of that family form is that there are more disputes. And so it's not surprising, Mr. Speaker, that we are required, programs are required in our courts to actually provide assistance to those family forms. That's what explains the numbers. We haven't become inefficient all of a sudden. There simply are more. But what the minister has done in this case, for some perverse attitude towards the law profession that I don't understand this minister's attitude to that, it's actually not even listening to her own expert groups that she brought together to give her advice, and she's not following that. So the logic of this just is not there to follow. It is this is an ideological trip of this government. It actually is hostile to the vulnerable. But maybe there is something a little more sincere, Mr. Speaker. I think the minister and some others have been captured by a number of powerful people who can say, look what my partner did to me, and that's because of the services they have available to them in the courts, and that ought not to happen, and this minister and this government has got captured by them. Because I've heard those arguments as well, Mr. Speaker, by some people who want to go to fight with their partners in court. When they lose, they blame the system, and yet the system was designed simply to protect our children. And so this is an ideologically driven set of proposals. It is based on flawed logic. It is based on a rather miserly view, on attitude to a small amount of money, and it will end up by having to be fixed up again someplace down the track. So for those reasons, we have fought against this, and we will change that when we're in government. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
I call Jan Logie.